What's up, nerds? It's been a long time. I'm here with Victor Tay, who works on the China-ASEAN Business Alliance. He's based out of Singapore, knows a little bit about China, so we know that that's definitely been in the news a lot lately in terms of the potential uh, tension and opportunity between the U.S. and China and the rest of the world. So we're going to get into all of that. But before we do it, we'll have Andrew warm us up.
Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Victor, how are you, sir?
Yes, I'm fine. Great. I'm in Singapore right now, and so we are about 16 hours, 14 hours difference, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate you coming on to the Nerd Show. You're actually not the first guest from Singapore that I've had on. My brother was on the show when he was in Singapore in the past. He was a resident for some time, and my wife is Singaporean. So definitely good to talk to someone on the island.
Yes. And when's the last time I came back to Singapore?
The last time I was there was probably I want to say early 2019. Before the pandemic, of course. And we used to go pretty much every year, every other year, often for Chinese New Year, but haven't been back since 19.
Okay, that's
and
quite recent. That's quite recent.
yeah,
I think for those who hadn't been to Singapore since 2010, then there are great differences.
oh yeah,
Just at the skyline itself, where the
yeah,
marina is,
yeah,
before, if you are there since before 2010, it
yeah,
was totally South China Sea.
yeah,
And if you come back after 2010, it was Marina Bay Sands, there
yeah,
were Marina Barrage, there were financial center, and all have been reclaimed and all
yeah.
have been rebuilt to even tall skyscrapers around 70 level talls, and with a whole financial district that were reclaimed within 5 years.
It's incredible. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember seeing that, and I remember them talking about it. I had lived there from 99 to 01, and they had talked about, these new projects, and I was like, oh, that'll never work. It's too ambitious. But, hats off to the Singaporean government for pulling it off. I mean, clearly, they were able to execute.
Yes, and central to that skyline that we see was Marina Barrage. There was actually Singapore demonstration of the barrage was made of recycled water, and the
Mm,
recycled water means they are household recycled water. And because Singapore has been independent and island without natural resources, and we buy water from Malaysia, and we actually import natural gas from Indonesia. So practically, sometimes as neighbor asks, they are friendly spats, and they will say, "We'll cut off the water supply."
hmm
So with that, I think that was a demonstration of political will to say, let's survive on our own water supply. And where did the water supply come from? They come from all the household recycled water.
mm,
And so the barrage actually congregates all the recycled water, recycle it, went through the UV, ultraviolet rays,
hmm
filtering, purification, and finally recycled back to the household. And that, by demonstration, by the world standard, it was like 99% one of the purest water. That was by
mm.
the World Water Association who highlighted that. And the second part is, I think this is the largest in the whole worldwide area that they have seen in public consumption of recycled water. And in Malaysia, I think they sometimes jest over how Singaporean does it. They actually laughed at, "Hey, you were drinking your own pee," but actually, that's totally scientific, and that's a huge demonstration of how water purification works.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think Bill Gates is a big fan of that type of technology too, and it's uh it's incredible what but you still need the natural gas though.
Yes, that's right. And
Yeah.
and in 2010, Singapore did thought about how to conquer the Achilles heel. It was mooted to use a nuclear plant.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that was within the Economic Strategy Committee. But at the same year, 2010, in Japan, the Fukushima incident happened. So
That
I
put the
guess it was
brakes
great too.
on.
Yeah, I think it was great too to give us a warning to say what could have happened if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And while Japan has multiple sites that can be nuclear, but Singapore has only one site, and there's
Yes.
only one island, which is
Yeah.
merely just 720 over square kilometer. So
Yeah.
if that happens, we have no more second island to live on.
Yeah. Now you guys don't have that many like earthquakes though, luckily, right?
Yeah, interestingly, where our neighbors actually had tsunamis,
Mhm.
or even I think that's where Thailand, Indonesia at times had a tsunami, and Philippines actually had hurricane cyclones, right? But Singapore just nested right in between, and we were
Hmm.
shielded from all of this. It was actually void of any natural calamity, so not even
Well,
earthquake.
lucky
Maybe we
you.
were just too
Yeah.
small.
Yeah, the target's too small. Well, look, tell us a little bit about what you do with the China-ASEAN Business Alliance and the work with the United Nations as well. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Victor.
Oh yes, I'm a vice chair with the United Nations Global Compact, and
Uh-huh.
that particularly focusing at CSR and the 17 SDGs. Global Compact very much reconcile businesses and ensuring business and its value supply chain actually uh, focus on an ethical way of operation, having a compact or contract so that they fulfill their social contribution, their social obligations. And in this sense, in the past, where there were the sweatshops, hiring of the underage and all the rest, I think in here we looked at it how to do it constructively. Of course, within all these issues, there were ethics ground, etc. So very much within the United Nations Global Compact (UNGC), we promote on education, awareness building, forging sustainability indicators and indexes, getting sure the value chain to look at how things are. And notably, I think for this part of the world in the last few years, uh, we had a case where in Indonesia, they were I think the farming practices are quite different. And for those who are familiar, if you're back in Singapore, every now and then at a certain season, we will have
The
this
smoke.
smoke fog.
Yes, I
Yeah,
remember
and
that.
this smoke, yes. And at its worst, it actually went up to 400 psi.
Mm,
And that means visibility is less than 3 to 5 meters away, which is
mm,
highly dangerous if you're driving. And that how that incurred, and many of them were asking, but Singapore is such a green and clean country. How did this smoke come about? And that originated from Indonesia, which is the fourth largest world population in the world, and
mhm,
Indonesia by itself is a huge, massive land, and in there, farmers who are quite, I think, by itself they are living in low capital, in terms of financial support. So in there, with only their resources, they tend to slash and burn as a practice, which means that once the land actually went out of fertility, by burning it down, it actually gives it a refertilization process.
mhm,
But I think with that, this in modern world, we have actually used tractors. We will actually use saws, capital equipment, just to remove some of this, or even refertilize it. But it takes
mhm,
millions or hundreds of thousands, right? So in here, it's just with a match and an ignition point, the whole thing get burned down, and with that, it sustained across weeks to months, and this created huge smog or pollution, and this actually drift across Southeast Asia, and that created the annual smog that Singapore has. So, but what does UNGC do, right? We looked at it where how do we ensure that some of this um, companies who actually buy, and this are predominantly palm oil agriculture, and those
mhm,
who are palm plantation, to see that whoever who buys from them educate that all this small farm hold, how to actually does it in the most at a more civic way, a more responsible way. And the second part is the larger company like P&G, Unilever, to also ensure the whole value chain actually has something like of a sustainability certificate, so that it comes from some of those with proper practices. And those who don't, that's where they do not buy from them. And probably that gives them a lot of restriction to try to actually learn about what the newer ways of doing it. Yeah, so that's one of those projects that we do as well.
Yeah.
Huge project, involves multiple regime, associations, societies, even down to the small farm hosts. Yeah.
And did you see, has it had any impact on these practices? Or are the big brands kind of encouraging their suppliers to use more sustainable methods, or
Yes.
what's the impact?
Yeah, where smoke is concerned, I must say that since 2014, they went up to 400 psi. Now it's 2021. For the last 7 years, we didn't quite see that as much now. Yeah,
Mhm.
and I guess when you came back to Singapore in 2019, you never quite see the usual smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess it has a certain effect, but
Yeah.
surely I think there are some small farm hosts who are still not so educated, maybe financially also not well supported, may still resort to it. But I guess they would not have traveled 100 kilometers over to Singapore in that case.
Well, it's a perfect example of this climate kind of discussion we're having internationally, right? But where if you were the small farmer in Indonesia and you're like, hey, I own this little plot of land, and I know that if I burn the crops at the end of the, season, or after harvest, if I burn the remnants, I can renew that soil for another crop next year, and it doesn't cost me anything. I don't have to buy any special equipment or special chemicals from agribusiness or whatever. And then someone says, "Oh, but you're creating carbon." It's like, well, look, I got to feed my family. And I think that's part of the argument from some of the developing countries when the US and other developed countries say, no, everybody has to kind of become more efficient. It's some places just don't have the resources to do that, to do the right thing for the collective good.
So you're precisely
Yeah.
right. You're precisely right. And I guess in COP26 at Copenhagen, we saw
Mhm.
Bangladesh who actually came up, and their prime minister who actually highlighted that said Bangladesh is actually situated at the South Asia. It faces natural calamity throughout the whole year, from
Mhm.
the coastal line that were heavily flooded, and then down to cyclones that it faced, and most of them predominance of the lives in under UN average per day capital, and therefore they are under
Mhm.
poverty, right? So they highlighted that they have been spending lots of money fighting some of this natural calamities, and in here they ought to be funded. That's one. And secondly, I think, and that's where India came about and highlighted about climate justice. India highlighted that the whole worldwide, of course, in Europe and all the rest, Europe came up early in terms of environmental protection and policies embracing.
Mhm.
They had it
Mhm.
since 1970s. That's almost
Yeah.
50 years ago. So in that case, I think India was highlighting that. But some of this were outsourced. Most of your pollutive activities were outsourced to the South Asia. So as a consequence, from Bangladesh to India,
Mm.
they they were they were seen as carbon emission, but actually by the European or American-led MNCs. So I guess in this case, Bangladesh highlighted the same about the climate justice and therefore requesting more for help and assistance. So you're right, and I guess in this case, most of them is a vicious cycle. For instance, Bangladesh, those who actually operate at the coastal, not only the line get flooded, their houses get submerged. They were nomadic; they move around, and that is a downward spiral where not only their farm and crops get submerged in the water, they lost their livelihood, they lost their house, and it's hard to send their children to education because there's no funding, right, financing, right. So for them
Mhm.
was how to survive, and hence the entire community there were just at the brink of survival on how to move on again and again to areas. So United Nations went in, tried to do mangrove swamp, and areas, and in order to just anchor the ground so they won't erode further. But you can't control where water tides is, and we all knew somehow the water level are rising, seawater level, and because of that, so most of the countries are at the risk, and Bangladesh is, even Singapore. In 2018, I think the Prime Minister's speech has highlighted how we should be warding against some of these flooding issues as well. Yeah, so quite a lot of issues to solve. You're right.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And on the one hand, I live in California. We're generally pretty pro kind of green energy and environmental sustainability here. But I also recognize that as a country, I mean, we in America had a century of industrialization without any restrictions. And so if someone had said to us in the 50s and 60s, oh, you can't run all these factories and you can't run all of this coal power because you're hurting the rest of the world's environmental kind of health, I think we would have said, you go to hell. Like, we're going to do what we're going to do. But we're basically telling other countries now, oh, we got in when the getting was good, but now, you can't do what we did. Right. And so there clearly has to be a way to make it more economically attractive for people to do the right thing. But yeah, super cool. And what's your work on the China-ASEAN Business Alliance? What's that about?
Yes, the China-ASEAN Business Alliance is actually one of those spin-off from ASEAN. And ASEAN, many of listeners here will be wondering, what's ASEAN, right? And that's Association of Southeast Asia nations, and it practically binds the 10 countries within Southeast Asia together. And it has been there since the 1960s, 70s. And with this conceptualization, it came about. Initially, it was about peace, because in the early 1960s and the 50s, there had been still then the Russia, the North Korea, the communist system, etc. And so there was a need to reconcile and see that this part of the world, we still remain peaceful, and there are security packed throughout, and none of us here in the 10 countries were then politically affected or influenced. So the 10 countries came about from peace. But subsequently, I think now we are about 50 over years now. So ASEAN now is actually very much more economic. So ASEAN had recently signed something like called RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership. That's a 16 countries, and that is actually a continuation of what TPP was, right? US moved to the Transatlantic Pacific Pact, but unfortunately, I think that wasn't continued. So the RCEP was established by China, and then of course with Japan, Korea, and the rest of the region here in ASEAN. So this 16 countries come about on trade, and ASEAN. If most of us are asking, what's the significance of ASEAN? Southeast Asia seems remote, and we are talking about the most rural and rudimentary of needs here, right? Southeast Asia has close to 700 million population, and that by itself is one of the third largest in the whole world after China and India. Second part, ASEAN since 2020 collectively has foreign direct investment that's in rate that surpasses China. So therefore, by itself, is one of the highest growing economic region. And within here, the 700 million population is one of the youngest population in the world. I knew the whole world is facing aging population, but in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, the average age of, let's say, Vietnam, 23 years old, and the average age of Philippines, 25 years old. That's extremely young, and that by itself is strong procurement power. Consumer goods procurement is strong, and that is also marking out that within Southeast Asia, ASEAN by itself, it actually has one of the largest production base and also consumption base of the whole world. It by itself is number one in palm oil production. In terms of some of the consumer goods, etc., these were agriculture plants. In terms of rice, it's also second and third producer in the whole world. And US by itself, in the whole of Asia, had invested the most in ASEAN. It's the investment was about 300 billion, and this 300 billion is 5 times in China investment, US and China, about 4 times what it has in Korea and even Japan as well. So
Wow.
that explains why I think US has a particular interest in looking at ASEAN and South China Sea, and because this part of the world is also an important trade route. This was since the Maritime Silk Route time, and also in terms of when Singapore was first founded by British Sir Stamford Raffles in 1890. They said this is a global trading hub, and with that, almost 1/3 of the world trade actually flows through this region. If something that actually happened here, most of the trade will be blockaded, and then most of the supply chain will be obstructed, and even I think on yearly basis, 100 million of barrels of oil actually flow through here. And right in Singapore backyard, something called a Jurong Island. And this island itself does oil distillation, oil refinery, and oil storage. And Singapore, even though we are not oil explorer of the world, we actually are the top 3 largest oil storage in the whole world. So if that so that marks the importance of why ASEAN is and why the Association of Southeast Asia came together to look at peace and economic in this region.
And how do you all look at China? Is China like your best customer supplier? Or are they a adversary? How do you see China?
Yes, well, I mean, if we looked at it, of course, and I just also highlighted, ASEAN has one of the largest trade where US actually invested here, but the number 1 top trading partner is China, and likewise for China, top trading partner is ASEAN. So both sides are top trading partners in economic exchange, in goods and everything, right? And in here by itself, especially food, China has 1.4 billion population. They are net importer of food and net importer of energy and oil as well. So in this case, ASEAN has been a critical partner to them. And like it or not, it has been in here where close proximity, they are neighbors, ASEAN and China. And it has been in here since a long time, where I think in the 17th centuries, we had Admiral Cheng Ho, who actually was a great navigator and explorer, came from Quanzhou of Fujian province in China, who then sailed through the South China Sea, went around, and it's almost like the equivalence of the Portuguese great navigator, right, of the Columbus and all the rest. So in this case, with that, the trade has been established and relationship has been established. And you just merely look at the population within this part of the world. Many are Chinese immigrants, or if not, they were Chinese descendants here too, right? But nonetheless, there's a difference between ethnically Chinese and whether you are in nationality of China, from China, right? So therefore, there's a difference here.
Oh yeah.
And yes, and in here, I think just looking at a more recent happening like 2020, right, where the whole world sunk into pandemic and issues with coronavirus. And when it happened, I guess this happened pretty fast, where in Wuhan, where it happened was December in 2019, but not much people knew about it until February 2020. I think the first few cases came to Singapore because of China has a lot of tourists who come to Singapore here, and which then the worldwide start realizing in March, April, it went to Europe and subsequently to US as well. Chinese actually found some of the vaccination, and I guess with that, about third quarter in 2020, they have been actually sending this to Southeast Asia. They were giving their licensing right to Indonesia, to say that, because Indonesia has about 400 million population there. So therefore, with that, they allowed them to actually, with that licensing, manufacture for their population. And they also donated to the Cambodia, Laos, and all the rest there. And of course, we see some of the vaccine diplomacy there. China also sent some of this to Italy, Europe, and all over the world to show their goodwill as well. So I guess that's the part of apart from economic competition that we saw from US-China trade war. But in this case, there are, I think, all this shining example where despite all differences, many, I think, are united in humanities, actually put together such gifts to help each other. And I guess vaccination is one part of this.
Yeah, I definitely, there's probably going to be some people hearing this saying, well, they should have been doing what they could to help because there were things they could have done to contain it further earlier. But we'll let the historians argue over that. But in terms of Singapore's relationship with China from an economic point of view, I mean, there was a time where Singapore was producing stuff too and had manufacturing, and that a lot of that went over to China. And you see a little bit of that in the US, or a lot of it, where our manufacturing has much of it has moved offshore. And I'm curious, how has Singapore handled that and dealt with that? Because I'm guessing there was a time where there were a lot of Singaporeans who worked in those manufacturing businesses and their jobs went away. How did you all manage that transition?
Yeah, so you're right. Singapore came about independence, very young nation, 1965, which is 50 over years ago. And those are economic activities, foreign direct investment, and manufacturing was the first one who came in. And Singapore attracted in the 1969-70 first Seagate into and Maxtor, which were into some of this hard disk drive, right?
Yeah,
So at that
word.
time, that was already a modern technology.
Yeah.
And that slowly bring us into about 30 or 40%, which are of our economic activities come from manufacturing. So subsequent years, we do see, yes, you're right, some of the exodus of precision engineering, semiconductors, some of the cheaper, lower value added activities that were actually moving out to various countries, not just in China, but Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. And definitely, I think a global multinational seek a cost-effective area to manufacture. But at the same time, Singapore right now, as it is, we are still retaining about 28% of our GDP in manufacturing. I'm not so sure about US, but 28% is still quite high.
Yeah.
I know in Hong Kong, they had 90% all services. They have only less than 8% in manufacturing for Hong Kong. But Singapore still retain that. And you'll be asking, then what is your manufacturing base in Singapore? So we had Pfizer, GSK, and Pfizer had announced they'll be making the vaccines in Singapore. And previously, all the drugs, pharmaceutical plants are all established here. These are all high capital investment and also high knowledge as well. Second part, just now I started off saying about this part of the world is where hundreds of millions of barrels of oil actually flow through here. Important maritime silk route, and Singapore is a oil storage place, an oil refinery. So the whole worldwide send their oil and petrochemical plants to Singapore, petrochemical and to Singapore, and we actually help to distill, store, and everything. So that's also a manufacturing. That by itself is also a part of what we do. And we had in Singapore a civil aviation hub. Many of these flights actually transit via Singapore. So with that, we spun off our MRO base, maintenance, repair, overhaul, and some of this aircraft servicing. And so previously, Rolls-Royce came here, and Rolls-Royce with a huge Trent engine that was supposed to establish that for the Airbus A380, which is 800 seaters, huge, monstrous airplane, right? So the Rolls-Royce engine requires highly efficient, at the same time, engines that could not have defects, right? Because if engines with defects, planes will actually drop from the sky in this case. So they chose Singapore, and therefore with that, we are all positioned towards all the high-end precision engineering, high-end pharmaceutical, oil and gas, maritime, etc. So Singapore still have that. And so when we looked at it, as you asked, then China had been taking some of this. We felt actually fine. In fact, Singapore has been a regional headquarters for Asia Pacific for 70% of the Fortune 500 companies. And in this case, normally even manufacturing is done in China. Headquarters, sales office, Asia Pacific headquarters is still based in Singapore. We felt that helps us in the cost effectiveness. Yeah, and so we did not feel that we are competing with them. We felt they forged their own niche, and here it is. We are on the other spectrum of the manufacturing.
Well done. Well, Victor, we're going to take some questions from the audience in a minute. But before we do that, I need to thank some of the sponsors of this channel who pay our bills. So just give me 1 second to run through a few of the folks who make this channel possible. And first of all, we want to thank Soldier One, who is a senior vice president who's been supporting the channel for 19 months. Thank you, Soldier One. At the next level, we have the VPs, Kristen Slevin, Laura Lane, and Bike. And then the next level under that, we have our hardcore, Mike, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Byram, Mona, Susan, Yang, Tony, Robert, Dean, Statner, Galessa, Jay Perrin, AH, Jay Bryan, Vivian, Dana, Yoda, Jason, and Parth. And then at the entry level, the verified nerds, thank you for your support. Lisa, Sugar, Albert, Brandon, Peter, Erez, Brian, your mom, and Sophia, Jadwiga, Mike, Doris, Emerald, Lori, Ben, Roger, Lisa Vaughn, Rasta, Elizabeth, James, Emma, Hui, Ira, Shoney, Philip, Jameson, Dr. A, William, Karen, Monica, Arden, Semery, Mai, David, Brittany, Sasha, Juana, Warren, Lucky, Kevin, Finney, and H3. So those are the folks who sponsor our podcasting costs, storage costs, video streaming costs. So appreciate it. Victor, before we get to questions from the audience, I want to make sure, did we cover some of the, was there anything top of mind that you wanted to share as it relates to either China or Singapore that you thought might be worth bringing up?
Yes, I guess recently we do see, or I mean, since 2018, where we had the Trump administration in the US, and we slowly see this tension between US, China, and we started to see some of this the trade war that came about. I guess as now it's 2021, looking back in 2018 and 19 and 2020, right? Almost 3 years now. The US-China trade war with the increase of tariffs, it has a certain impact, not just on US-China, but also on the rest of the world too, right? So that's something that that we should think about. That since the early years, I guess when US set up the Bretton Woods and Marshall systems, which then comes into financial trading, and with that, I think part of those that were set up were World Trade Organization, and therefore we say let's go for world trade, and free trade is good. And I guess we never quite look back with the free trade. And today, as I'm talking from China-ASEAN Business Alliance perspective for ASEAN, trade has been great. Trade allows all of us to thrive in exchange of goods, and with goods and services that benefit all our communities so that we can advance further, right? So I guess in 2018, with the tariffs that came about, and that in some way does impede some of this free trade. And in this case, we do see the victims of such a situation. Whoever pay for the imports, U.S. importers, let's say Apple. Apple has a lot of parts that were made in China naturally, and many of the semiconductors parts and etc. When they brought in, the Apple cost has gone up higher, 25% tariffs, and all the internal parts have gone up higher. And so naturally, one is Apple has to pay for that, and then the consumer has to pay higher for that. And I guess when it comes to, let's say, a Korean Samsung phone that's sold in US, it doesn't need to have a 25% if it doesn't have the Chinese part, right? So in comparison, that tariffs itself does hurt quite a few people. I mean, from the traders to the US manufacturer down to the consumers too. And I guess likewise, vice versa, we saw in China, many of the subcontractors and manufacturing plants, and because the 25% tariffs slap of them as a almost like a trade barrier, a lot of them lost business from US, right? So as a consequence, many of them diverted part of their manufacturing subcontracting plants or even the supply chain to Southeast Asia. So you see Vietnam all of a sudden were ballooning with a lot of manufacturing plants, and because the origin of manufacturing parts no longer come from China, it comes from Vietnam, it actually gets a lower tariff, right? But of course, subsequently we saw that US started to slap or threatening Vietnam with tariffs, and they also put tariffs on Mexico and Tokyo and Japan as well. So I guess, yeah, I think we were looking at the free trade as one of the way where the advances are so far. That's something that, because of the Trump administration, that's something that's quite unusual. And of course, if we are in 3 years now, we do see it actually does more harm to all parties around. Yeah. So that's a context I
Oh
want to put it
yeah.
in.
Yeah, no, it's a great topic, and it's a difficult one because Trump was greatly rewarded politically for implementing these tariffs. And I think the narrative was, for his followers believed, hey, here's a guy who's sticking up for the US and trying to defend American interests against an unfair economic adversary. And you know, that I think in Trump's words, the U.S. had been taken advantage of by China. Now, you and I can make the argument that, okay, well, if you add these tariffs, like it just means like the price of stuff to American consumers goes up. But that is not a line of thinking that comes intuitively when when the followers of Trump just see, oh yeah, he's sticking it to China. And so, and in fairness to Trump, Biden has not rolled back those tariffs because I don't think he wants to be seen as kowtowing to China, uh, irrespective of how much relief it could have provided to American consumers. And so it's a very delicate topic, and I'm curious about, when you talk about free trade, one of the talking points, which I think is relevant, it may not be kind of as crucial as maybe other people say it is, but it is true that, isn't it true that China does subsidize a lot of its industry and does make it difficult for some foreign companies to compete in the home market? Um, what has the ASEAN Business Alliance experienced any of that, or do you feel like, oh no, we can sell as much as we want into China and we can operate there, and it's a fair fight?
Yes, yeah, we trade with China as I had explained. It's number one trading partner on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
You're right that we have signed many of the FTAs, free trade agreement. Singapore has signed with 80% of the whole world where free trade agreement is.
Yeah.
Singapore has embraced free trade. So anyone can come to Singapore with no trade barriers, and we go out to numerous countries, 80% of them without. But numerous country does have its own. And I can imagine China wanting to protect its own agriculture, and so does US, and therefore has this trade barrier where agriculture supply is. We found when we go to China, of course, there are obstacles, there are areas of doing business that were not easy. And it's similar to even Singapore going to Indonesia because of cultural difference and because of business practice that were different. In here, as businessmen, we see that as it is more of the local practices that were different. And hence, we did not quite think of it as the government unfairly distorting it in such a way that it's become more challenging to us. But I can imagine that if we talk about in the 1980s, 1990s, I think that's where China first joined the WTO in 1980s. And as they were toddlers then, or maybe then 90s, even teenager. I think when it comes to practices, there are a lot of malpractices, or because many of them are not familiar with world trade. They have been doing things their own way. And I guess with that, that's almost similar to us going to any of the developing country, right? That we can name out, from Africa to Middle East to all aspect, or even the East European bloc, that this happens. But I must say, for these days, just looking at a track record in 2019 and 2020, right? Just by intellectual properties, China filed in 2019 1.5 million of intellectual properties in
Mm.
registration, and US filed 500 over thousand of intellectual property. So I'm trying to say, while in early years we accused that China, I think a lot of this copycats or even IP thefts, but looks like they had risen quite fast to try to respect intellectual properties. I mean, sure, I think there's no defense for them for what they've done in the past. But in recent years, it seems to have gathered their act and they understood how international works. So they need guidance, right? They need to guide with and therefore to work with. And that's how they have come into. And same for sustainability and environmental protection as well. They are now the largest wind energy adopters. They are one of
Mm.
the largest solar panel adopters of the whole world. And
Yeah.
I guess during Trump time, Trump had decided that US should withdraw from the Paris Protocol. So that's quite a irony here that we see that the Chinese were the one who are probably less environmental friendly, and here it is, US were the beacon of what environmental sustainability is, and here it is
Yeah.
retreating on it. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a bit ironic. I mean, I think from a Trump political interest point of view, the US natural gas boom has been very good for the economy in the near term. And any kind of action to limit that would have reduced his support for reelection. And love it or not, that's democracy is all about getting reelected. And I mean, sometimes you see presidents do things that are politically, sort of unfavorable to them, but are right for the country. But that's more of an exception.
and
But
I
yeah,
guess
I hear you.
and I guess you're right that US is a great nation that most of the whole world aspire to migrate to and attract the best and the brightest mind in the whole world. In terms of university education, one of the best that the whole world aspire and they send their children and they themselves
Mm,
goes to US universities. And many of them inherited the culture, and many of them understood what it is. And
mhm,
plus, US has the one of the strongest constitution, institutional rights systems that protect individual freedom, liberty, etc. A great nation as it is, and many of the world were looking at it and say, yes, that's what we are modeling after, and
mhm.
and 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 here it is. I guess as you were highlighting, that I think the recent years there is slight changes in the political field of it. That I mean, if Trump administration and you highlighted too, that sometimes politicians they have to appease some of their sponsors, their factions, and etc. And end up, as you said, some of them are drumming beats as it is towards the next political election or what was a popularity
Yeah.
votes or support versus what was necessary to do. And I guess despite that the Wuhan virus came from China, right? I was looking at the stats, and naturally, the whole world, even I mean, Singapore is a victim of this too. I was looking at the stats, and I noticed that of the million we measure right by the million of population who actually had deaths out of the
Mm,
COVID, China was out of a million was under 10, and for Europe and US were by the five, six, 700, right?
yeah.
And to say and to look at it, I mean, before we even delved even into political system or communist or even democracy, etc., I must say that, and you probably watched the part where when Wuhan came about, etc., they started to build hospital in 6 days, 7 days to finish it, and they
Mhm.
acted on it, and it looks like they were able to do what was right for the people, and they kind of, I mean, in this case, prevented more deaths. In this case, I mean, that's something that I felt it seems like the recent Chinese political and economic system seems to have slight changes. And I'm sure you visited China, they are a capitalist embracer as well. Huge
Yeah,
capitalists, and they produce the most number of millionaires throughout every year, right?
yeah.
So to say that they are communists like in North Korea or like in Russia, it's quite different now. So I have to
Mhm.
say, despite looking at them, they seem to have changed quite a bit in the way how they acted. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's for sure. I think in the case of COVID again, it would have been very politically damaging for Trump to take responsibility for the lack of COVID response, because he took the position early on that it wasn't a real problem and that it
Yes.
would go away naturally. And he's not one to say, I was wrong. I've never heard him say that. And so it was in his interest to keep the rallies going. And it was quite sad and cynical, because I'm sure he knew that people died that didn't need to maintain the cover, that this was just nothing but a flu, a bad cold that would go away with the hot weather. And here we are, still struggling with it. I'm curious, in Singapore, I remember looking at the numbers at the surge 1 and 2, and it was so impressive how Singapore really kept it at bay. I think lately Delta did kind of rear its head in Singapore. How are you all doing now? What's the state of things on the ground over there?
Yes, great question. And I think in here we are all the societal norm is back to normal. We are in restaurants, ability to wine and dine together with 5 head counts per table. We still restrict low numbers. Going to work, I think we request for a weekly test, ERT test, and in this case, because we insist on weekly tests, the COVID number are high, the infection, because the more you test, the more rigorous is your testing regime. Yeah, the more you identify.
Yeah.
Now, Singapore has been.
That
great
reminds
at
me, the Trump policy was that in order to lower the numbers, we should test less.
So you're right. And in the beginning, Singapore our infection rate were only a few cases a day, or maybe less than 10, and we were zero since April all the way to September. For 4-5 months we were 0 cases.
Yeah.
Now then of course the rest of the world started to label and say Singapore is one of the safest country and where COVID is concerned.
Yeah.
Then of course you're right now to look at it and say, thanks for the stats. I think,
Yeah.
And since August, you see the spikes, right? Because Singapore decided to embrace, in the whole world, there are 2 ways of governance to COVID. One is the East Asia, the China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau. They did the zero COVID policies rules, which means that in zero COVID policies protocol, once you highlighted someone, you get quarantined, they stops all work, everyone stay home for 2 weeks. Singapore decided in August to embrace the other side of the world's practices, which is EU and US. Basically, EU and US highlighted that we are vaccinated. Singapore has about 87%, 88% of vaccination now. So we kind of highlighted that, hey, it's endemic. If we are vaccinated, we are still hiding at home, then what's the point of being vaccinated? So it liberalizes it and says that now we uplift all the rest of the other regulations. Now children are back to school, everyone are at work, and everything are in normalcy. And in fact, since the whole of this year, it had been back to normalcy. And with this and the rigorous testing, it went up high. Then, of course, if the East Asian were to look at it from Hong Kong and China point of view, would say, wow, you're very high, you're highly infectious. But we knew that from this part of it, that this infection rate, because you're vaccinated, frankly, it is just like a normal flu. And hence the death rate is minimal.
Yeah.
And many of them recovered. So it become quite meaningless to track the infection rate now to us. And we are now looking at the ICU, the healthcare beds, and to see that people, if this critical illness capacity are still there, and if it is there, I think we are quite fine. So I guess that explains the number that you see.
That makes a ton of sense. I think the key thing was that you were able to kind of treat this as the new normal after getting most of the population vaccinated. Had you done that, I would imagine, had you not gotten most of the population vaccinated, I'm guessing the death rate probably would have been higher. How was that, getting people vaccinated in the US? I think around 80% of Democrats are vaccinated, but only 50% of adult Republicans are vaccinated. So it's become a very political issue. And a lot of people feel like, hey, they want to use ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine and all these other things, but that to get vaccinated is to join the other political party. Did you how did that land in Singapore? Was there a lot
Uh,
of political discussion or resistance?
in Singapore, I think one thing about it is I think everyone evaluated Singapore as the one of the most competitive economy in the world. We had always been ranked number one, number two, and all throughout. And with this, part of the strong point of the factor why it's highly competitive because it has a strong government and a strong governance in here. And so when it comes to promoting vaccination, the education process had been quite thorough. Everyone understood what it meant, and none of the people were linking it to political aspect. But most of them knew that it is a choice you can take, and with this, the vaccination is not politically drummed up. You have a choice of. We had a choice of Pfizer, Moderna, even Sinovac. Sinovac
Mhm.
came very last part of it. It was the last we approved. I think initially many of us doubt the effectiveness of it, uh, and with that, people get to choose it. And I guess at 87%, you highlight that what happened to the rest of the 10%. We do notice that those who are not vaccinated tends to be slightly more senior in age, and I guess because of certain illness they had, and with this, it was more challenging. The complication that came out of it, and some of them are more wary of it, right? So I guess now in social practices, what we had is in restaurants, they will check the vaccination status before they can be admitted. So I guess that created incentives to
Oh,
be vaccinated.
well, that's probably one of the biggest incentives of all. Having lived in Singapore, I know eating is a national pastime. So if you were not vaccinated, you couldn't go into what about like a hawker center or something like an outdoor eating place?
Yeah, so initially it started with only restaurants, so they can still go to
Uh-huh.
hawker center. But since the recent case where the more we test, the more infection rate there are, we kind of also restricted hawker center as well. and
Wow.
so and so, which means that they practically had no they can only take away, right? They
Yeah.
cannot enter. They have to take away. And
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Singapore has one of the lowest. It's one of the best spectrum of food because it has
Oh
a
yeah.
multicultural from Indian food, Chinese food, Indonesian,
Yeah.
Western, German, French. You had a whole plethora of it. At the same
Yeah.
time, they managed to keep the cost of food very low. And the hawker centers are one of those that kept even the lowest 20% or 15% of Singapore population as still accessible to food. Food of noodles, for instance, or it's about, or maybe even a chicken cutlet, about just $3 or
Yeah.
two and a half US dollar. Yes.
Mm. That's whenever we go back to Singapore, we will often drop our stuff off at the hotel or the place we're staying, and then the first thing we do is go eat, and it's a top priority.
Yes,
um,
yes.
well,
And
Victor,
same for yeah, same for Singaporeans too, right?
yeah,
Every
of course,
morning they wake up, they will have talked to each other and say, "What are we gonna eat for dinner?
yeah,
What's our lunch appointment? Which
right,
restaurant
right,
to meet?"
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I remember when I lived there, people would greet me and they would say, "Oh, have you taken your lunch yet?" And I didn't really know how to respond to that because I didn't know it was like a common greeting, but it was part of the culture. Let's hit some quick questions before we wrap up. Do you have another 7 minutes to talk, Victor? Is that okay?
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay. So Caleb wanted to know about how you think China is doing on climate change. I mean, you talked a little bit about their wind production, and they are definitely dominating solar panel production. They also still rely a lot on coal. I know we talked a bit about the Indonesians burning all the stuff. Like, how do you feel about China emitting at its current rates of carbon?
Yes, and Caleb is right that we do see China building not just solar, even down to wind energy, windmills. I think they had the most in the whole world now. And in here, the capacity building infrastructure for environmental is a lot larger than they're building coal plants. But they are transiting. It is a 1.5 billion population, and with almost 8%, 7 to 8% of GDP growth yearly. So to transit entirely into all solar, it was difficult, right? So therefore, it's a transitional phase that I see they still have the coal plants, but the rate of establishing coal plants is a lot lesser now. It has slowed down, and I was talking to the government officials. They were looking towards almost zero coal plants in future, and so they're totally reliant on solar or even wind energy as well. And many of them are now talking about hydrogen energy, and hydrogen, of course, is a clean form of energy. And with them, they had on all their sites facing the sea. I think that's where they were looking at how to tap on the hydrogen energy towards that. So coal plants is something that is in the past that I guess many of us want to transit to. And as a matter of that, even Singapore, because we're relying on 90% of natural gas from Indonesia, we have to actually have our plant. So in our energy plant, we also had incinerator, even as green as we are. So I guess we are looking to phasing it out. So some of those plants are in transition. I guess they will be in the next 15 years, plus minus. Some of them will be slowly phased out.
Got it. And I guess if China's producing a lot of wind power now, they don't have President Trump's concerns about wind turbines causing human cancer. They're not worried about that. Did you hear about that? That was one of President Trump's big concerns about wind power, apparently. We won't go too much more about Trump. All right. So another question from Caleb. What's your view on the tension that it seems like there's growing tension between Taiwan and China? Is that being sort of drummed up by the media here, or are you seeing it as well?
Yes, yeah. Many of Singaporeans actually had immigrants all coming from then China, Taiwan, or Fujian province. Taiwan is a part of Fujian province in the past. If you go to Taiwan, some of their passport, in the native passport of Taiwan, they will write Taipei but Fujian province. That's how they see it, and so many of us can identify with that because a Singaporean has a large crowds of Fujian, Hokkien, or Fujian natives here. Now we had to understand about the history, right? That one will have to understand how did Taiwan and China this predicament comes about. So I guess if those who have tracked back far enough and understand in the 1840s, China went through this period, and I guess this is also something that we should think about when we think about shucks.
Are you running out of power?
Yeah, I thought so. But anyway, you can still see me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
You. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, China was forced to sign something called unequal treaties in the 1840s, and that came a time where the UK was selling trades goods in exchange for opium, and because of that, those were the Qing dynasty, and end up Chinese actually had a huge accumulation, and they have to no choice cut away Hong Kong, and that's where they gave it to Britain, and then they also cut away Macau, which gave to Portugal, and that came about where Taiwan actually it was invaded by Japan. And then of course we knew later on Japan was defeated, and therefore they had to actually pass over that to the local KMT. And the KMT, Kuomintang Party, is actually a Taiwanese party that used to be the ruler of China. So therefore, if you look at it, they were the prevailing government before the communists or CCP defeated them, right? So therefore, they retreated to Taiwan. So in summary, I want to highlight these areas of Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan were all previously China's sovereignty, and in many ways, it was seen as a humiliation to have lost them, and they wanted reclaimed back. Of course, we saw Hong Kong in 1997 was being given back to China as a form of political justice back, right? And so when it comes to Taiwan, no Chinese government will want Taiwan to be lost in this case. And frankly, I think you can see from the CCP or from China's mindset, no one wants to actually be the first one to start war. War by itself is bad for everyone. Chinese knew very well. All the Chinese leader would not want a war, right? And least it is to against their very own kind, who are their own natives, right? Because Taiwan used to be part of China. Many of them were relatives. A lot of friends. So in this case, that war is frankly not within Chinese mindset. But what is then instigating the war? I think part of it were a bit of the Democratic Party who will win, who is current government, who says that we'll never come back. But Chinese has offered and say, let's have two systems, that's fine. And I think as a bit of it being worsened is they are buying the F-22 planes and all the rest from US, and plus US coming often to try to almost influencing Taiwan to move towards pro-independence. So as long as Taiwan doesn't move into pro-independence, China is fine as what it is. And here it is, you can see they putting examples of Hong Kong and Macau when it goes back. They let it run as what it is, as a one country, two systems. And I think no one in China would want to disrupt the status quo. And this status quo is this economic progress. And it will be a fool of them to actually try to do any military action, unless it's provoked, unless it's something that Taiwan decided to go independence. Or maybe, I think, unfortunately, some of the mismaneuvers of the 7 fleets in this part of the world, or even from Australia too, right? So if not, we'll say we expected a lot of peace here. And I think those saber rattling are not necessary. And hence, I think part of why I came on some of the station like this to actually let everyone know that I guess a peace is what people want. I think nobody wanted war. Neither would the Taiwanese as well, and neither will the Chinese. And if you trace back in history in the past 30 years, China do send some, exercise, their military exercise, or even they kind of fire 1 or 2 shots into the sea, right? It was at most a threat, right? No one wanted to start the war. But I guess some of this maneuver or some of this threat, if it comes too close, it might then erupt a war. And that's why we urge everyone to be more level-headed in here. Yeah.
Thanks, Victor. I know you're running low on battery, so I'm going to ask one last question from Mr. History Fan, who says the Laos high-speed railways is about to complete. Do you foresee a railway that would interconnect ASEAN with China?
Yes, I think that's a great question. In fact, in Guangxi, the western part of Guangzhou, they had a place called Nanning. And from Nanning, they have been hosting something called China-ASEAN Summit for the last 15 years or more. And in here, all the prime minister, the leaders all met there on political exchanges and on economic trade as well. And part of that project was having a Nanning, a super highway and a fast rail that cut across from Vietnam, Thailand, all the rest down Malaysia and ending in Singapore. And with this as well, it does not then require flying from China to fly over to Singapore. It takes about 4 hours or so, and plus transit maybe even 6. With a fast rail, I think it can be done within 3 hours. So I guess that would have been great improvement in trade, and that's something that many of us were looking forward to. Yeah.
Exciting. Well, Victor, I really appreciate you taking the time. And I hope, by the way, as an American, that ASEAN-US relations remain strong and good. I think there's a lot to be gained from both sides, and but also appreciate that, you're from a place that embraces free trade and you engage with many countries, but hopefully the US will remain on the list as well.
Yes, definitely. In fact, President Harris flew to ASEAN
Vice President Harris.
Vice President, right? Which just flew here
Yeah.
2 months ago, and basically flew to Singapore and Vietnam. And so Singapore, we signed a landmark cybersecurity a pact, and in here, I think US had always has its presence in the Philippines in the past, where Subic Bay, the naval building, and Singapore is also a naval logistics hub for US military as well, and same for in Vietnam, right? So I think in here, ASEAN definitely embrace US, and a lot of our practices from free trade and from environmental adoption and from some of our financing, etc., will all have been with US established for decades now. And I guess with this, yeah, we will wish that we have this for longevity. And I guess ASEAN had always had US at heart. And even though, and for us, we brewed this goodwill across all party that even China is a good friend to us. And I think we feel that this can be reconciled. And I guess we all can have a common goal to look towards how we can actually look towards climate financing, climate issues, sustainability. Humanity's problem is more than what the trade war is. And humanity's problem could be circumvented and can be addressed beyond some of this, which are, I think this are the war and all the rest. Actually, no one wants it. Everyone we talk to all had understood that who wants war, right? So in here, I guess maybe our mind we're better off addressing some of these issues that advance mankind, like Bangladesh issues, sustainability, one sun, one grid, one power grid systems, for instance. Yeah, that's something I'm heartened to be invited here. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Victor. It's been really a thought-provoking conversation, and appreciate you sharing your perspective on all these important issues. With that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Yep. Goodbye, nerds.
See you.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.